Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Brendan Lee. Hi, Brendan. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks.
And we're going to focus our attention on maths, perhaps the science of maths. But first, Brendan, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
Yeah, my name's Brendan Lee. I am from New South Wales, Australia. I am a assistant principal, so middle leader. I'm not on a class, so I kind of work more with teachers and running professional development and supporting them in implementing evidence-informed practice. And I guess I've kind of got involved in this movement of it's a bit of a groundswell of teachers in terms of trying to get the evidence moving into classrooms and just doing whatever I can to support that.
Excellent. I mean, you're also the host of what looks like a very popular and certainly deserves to be popular from what I've listened to, podcast based around knowledge for teachers.
Yeah, the Knowledge for Teachers podcast. Basically, I started that up as a way of, trying to further the impact that I can have. So I've also got a blog, learnwithlee.net, and both of those have just been a way of me trying to communicate, the different messages that need to be pushed out there, whether it's to do with mathematics or, I've also spoken to a lot of the science of reading people as well. And I guess just people who have actually got things happening in schools. One of the things I'm really interested in is the actual implementation part of it. When I first came across all of this research and, fell down that deep rabbit hole of looking at different areas, I started to wonder, like, why was all of this information not translating into improvements in student outcomes straight away? And so I kind of just started reading and researching and trying to find out like what actually needs to happen to make teacher behavior change in the classroom, and that's, I find that really fascinating as well, is just how difficult it is to get teachers to actually change what they're doing.
I love the sound of this. I mean, it feels like you're one of our kindred spirits, despite being on the sort of the other side of the world. But I mean, in terms of audience engagement with our podcast, because obviously we're set up to sort of support primary teachers and using sort of our best bets for improving our practice. And it goes England and then Australia. So there's definitely an appetite. And it might be that the systems have a lot of parallels between the two, I think, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. And I was talking to you before we started recording today about how it feels like in Australia that over in the UK, you guys are a couple of steps ahead of us in terms of actually implementing the evidence in the classrooms. And, you've got some quite prominent voices. I know that you've got, people like Christopher Such and Neil Armand and, people like that who you've got on your podcast a lot. And they're really well respected over here as well in Australia. And I think, the synergy between the two countries probably means that you've got a lot of Aussies listening to your podcast. And I think there are similarities apart from the fact that, we're both English speaking countries, probably just similarities in the actual, the systems themselves and, how they're set up.
I quite often like to look at other national curricula. And when I looked at the Australian national curriculum, or certainly one of the jurisdictions in Australia, it reminded me of the 1998 iteration that when I came into teaching in England, almost the specifications of the publication looked almost identical. So I think there's been a lot of leaning backwards and forwards, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure.
We have sort of decided to do a special version of both our podcasts where we're going to talk about roughly the same theme and perhaps see what each other sort of think. Because obviously we started talking predominantly about a blog that you wrote on learnwithlee.net, which was about the structure and a systematic approach to the teaching of maths. I think, normally I like to start with the what. What have you designed here when you're thinking about your approach to the teaching of primary mathematics?
Yeah, as I was kind of alluding to before, one of the things that I think teachers really want right now is they want to have things that are ready to use for their teaching practice. They've heard a lot of different things when it comes to, the translation of research. And now they want to start to actually know, okay, so what does that mean for me? What does that look like in the classroom? And one of the things that I was getting asked a lot about was, okay, so we've learned about the science of reading. We're starting to get a better understanding of what the science of learning actually means, holistically. But what does that look like in a mathematics lesson? And I was getting this question a lot from people, and I'd already kind of been putting together my own iteration of this, just for my own thinking. And then I thought, yeah, look, let's actually put it out there and see what other people think, see if it might be useful. And so what I've done was I put together like a general structure for a maths lesson. So from, the start of a learning sequence, through to the end, you could say, what sort of things I might be following and, what I would include and why. And it's general. And I think the purpose of it is to be general. Like I didn't want to get too specific, because if I got too specific, then it wouldn't be able to be used from K to 6 as well. So this is mainly talking about primary. Yeah, if I got too specific, then things might only be relevant for like a early stage 1 class, but not so relevant for like a stage 3, year 5 or year 6 group. So it's quite general. But yeah, look, it's definitely not set in stone. And I think that's kind of what kickstarted this conversation as well, is that I'm really open to other people's opinions. And I'd love to hear, what other people have to say about, what I put together and what they agree with and what they might do differently as well.
I mean, that's the way things go. Because when did I publish Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics? 2020. And I
Yeah.
don't think it would be identical were I to write it today. Because you listen to people and you read their work and think, actually, that's a much better way of approaching something than I would have in the past. But I really like how you've set it out. You've got here's some myths. Here are my sort of influences, and then here's what I would do. So you've almost sort of, you're given the rationale for your thought process. I mean, is that just something you built up over an extended period of time just from reading informally, or did you go and say, I'm going to read more about mathematics and research and education research and see how that applies? What was your thought process?
Yeah, good question. I guess my thought process was more around, if I kind of saw a bit of a gap in the math space, especially here in Australia. We've got a lot of strong voices when it comes to that science of reading, as I mentioned before. And so, but then when I started to look around as to like, who can we look to for that sort of leading voice as to what we should be doing for primary mathematics, there's not a lot of people out there who are really across, the evidence, the science of learning, and what that looks like, in a primary maths classroom. So it was more just falling into that space, and then having already a pretty good overview of what, how we learn and how teaching happens. Reading things like Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School, the books from Paul Kirshner and Carl Hendrick about, how teaching happens, how learning happens. Those sorts of books have been really formative in my own development. Even reading like Graham Nuttall's The Hidden Lives of Learners. And yeah, they've just given me a really good base of knowledge when it comes to understanding how learning happens. And so then when I started to look at a lot of the kind of suggested units of work that were being pushed out, I guess from the Department of Education, weren't necessarily following this. And so I was, I guess, asking questions of what we could be doing differently, and why did I get this feeling when I was looking at these units of work. And so that's when I also started to then dig a bit deeper into a lot of that research from a specific point of view from mathematics. And that's where I came across your book, and a whole bunch of books that I've listed on that page as well, just to try to have that domain specific knowledge as well, because there are some nuances involved there, when it does come to how we learn mathematics. And when I put that part at the start of the article, it was almost like an afterthought. It was like, oh, I better put something at the front just so that people know where I'm coming from. And I'm not just spitting this out, and it's just my kind of point of view. It's actually coming from this bit of research.
Nice. I mean, I really like it because you're almost planting your flag, and you've got some great, you've got the Bjorks in there, you've got Sweller and Clark, you've got William McRae, you know, it's essentially, it looks to me like the reading I was doing before, as I was developing sort of my awareness of sort of the cognitive psychology, the cognitive science. And, you know, as you're speaking there, I'm thinking a lot of my own work is based on the idea that despite the fact that lots of this research took place with postgraduates, undergraduates, or perhaps even older students, having seen its impact with younger children, you know, I quite like the idea that the science of maths is heavily informed by, you know, the general science of learning. And then from there, you, like you said, you take slight nuances and things together. Because for me, the research in the field of maths education isn't necessarily as robust as I would like it. I mean, did you find the same
No.
whenever you're trying to read more specifically about mathematics?
Yeah, definitely. While it's pretty conclusive for a lot of things in the science of reading, you do have to dig a lot deeper to find what you want to find when it comes to maths. And so my previous guest on the Knowledge for Teachers podcast, Karen Zanatopoulos, she was a co-author of a really good book that I recommend. I think it's How Students Learn the Science of Maths. And she wrote it with Nancy Krauser and Colleen Mass, and they've kind of put together the cognitive science together with specific stuff on mathematics and looked at how children learn maths. And I found that really good to find those links between language as well. There are a lot of similarities, and like you said, how we learn, once you have a good understanding of that, it just allows you to make better decisions and better choices when it comes to your pedagogy.
I'm really jealous of Chris whenever he talks about how almost certain the research in the field of reading is. Well, why didn't I choose reading? I was going for a specialist. If we think about the the actual content of your structure, what sort of message are you trying to give to anyone who's looking at this and they are going to interpret it and interpret your thoughts?
If we kind of just go walk through it, so the part that I start with is like the pre-lesson planning phase, and I put that in there because obviously it's not what you actually do in a lesson, but I think it's really important that we don't skip it. And so I just wanted to highlight that point, that these are some kind of questions that you should be asking before you actually enter the classroom. I'm not sure what it's like for you guys over in the UK, but here in Australia, like, we're flat chat just trying to have our lessons organised for the lesson that we're about to teach 5 minutes before. We're in the middle of a phase where a lot of schools have moved away from following textbooks. It'll be interesting to kind of hear your thoughts on this. But yeah, so they've moved away from the textbooks, and I think a lot of the reasons behind that are because teachers were generally just opening it up to a page and then saying to students, all right, this is where we're up to, go from there. So it was losing a lot of that actual explicit teaching of it. It was more just open up the page and go for your life sort of thing. Going back to that, like the pre-lesson phase, that planning is just so important when it comes to actually thinking about, all right, what am I teaching? Like, what are the actual learning intentions and success criteria? And it's funny, like, I know in education everywhere, we've had so much on what learning intentions are, but it's still so, sad in a way that you still enter a lot of classrooms and you can see that, like, the teachers and the students, they don't actually know what the purpose of that lesson is. You just see a lot of classes kind of going through the motions a little bit. And there's not much purpose. If you ask a lot of students, they won't actually be able to tell you what they're learning. And I think that's quite dangerous. And I think it's really important that we know what the purpose is of every lesson. And even if you just try to get to that point, it will really help guide your focus for your teaching. The other things I've got there, like prerequisite knowledge, common misconceptions, key vocabulary, hinge questions, and then how can you sequence the concept in small steps? And while they're quite, simple questions, they require a lot of domain-specific knowledge that, again, I'm not 100% sure on what your process is in the UK, but a lot of our teachers here don't have that knowledge that they actually need to answer those questions. Knowing how to actually sequence that concept in small steps, it's actually quite a difficult task when you really break it down. And same with knowing like those misconceptions and what to do if there is a misconception there. And I think that's why a lot of the reasons behind the, constructivism approach and inquiry-based learning, it's almost an easier way of teaching, of just putting out a word problem or, a question out there and then seeing if the kids can just figure it out for themselves. Like that takes the pressure off the teacher having to actually know what they're doing to teach. And again, like it's through no fault of their own. Like this comes back to how initial teacher education sets them up in the first place. So I think that's where we could fix a lot of these problems if we actually teach teachers the right things that they actually need to know. But yeah, I find that phase really important, but a lot of the times it's missed out purely because teachers are flat chat just trying to organize themselves for what they're about to teach their students. So it's like photocopying worksheets, they might finish off marking books, but yeah, there's not a lot of time for thinking to put into that process. So that's why I've got that there. After that, I'll go into, and again, like I'd really like to know your kind of point of view on this, but I call it a daily review, but it's not specifically in line with Rosenshine's daily review. There's a couple of kind of things which are a little bit different. And I know that some schools will like to make it a bit more specific than what I've got. But I've kind of just got some principles to follow and then main concepts to focus on. So the principles to follow, I've got retrieval practice, space practice, interleaving, and prerequisite knowledge. So when you're looking at like that space practice, so thinking about not just what you've been currently looking at, but last lesson, last week, last term, last year, really being quite specific with the time frame that you're looking at things. And then interleaving, like the way I'll kind of, the example I'll give of interleaving there is if you're looking at times tables and you might be focusing on the 4 times tables, throwing in a couple of other questions there just to make sure that the students are really thinking. So, you might have 4 times 5, 4 times 8, 4 times 6, and then a 5 times 8. If you've already covered division, you might have a division question in there as well. So just breaking up those questions so that you're looking at similar topics, but making sure that they're thinking. And then the other one there as well is that prerequisite knowledge. So you can do a lot of kind of front loading for your lesson by touching on things that students need to know for the concept that you're about to address. I find this really useful because it gives you a lot of information as to like where your starting point might be or what sorts of things you might have to focus on a bit more than maybe you had planned to. And then on top of the concepts to focus on, I've got, so your basic maths facts, number sense, vocabulary, mental maths, multiplication tables, and you might have like maybe 1 or 2 problem solving questions in there. But yeah, generally, depending on like what sort of time frame you're allocating to this, you might not have a problem solving question in there. I like to have these really like short and snappy questions so that it's fast flowing. I know that sometimes teachers can have the start of a lesson where they might have some games in there or what else might they do? I've seen like a lot of number of the day type things come in there. And I think like number of the day can be, and this is kind of where I see teachers really need to have like a strong understanding of what the purpose is. And so one of the problems with having like routines that are too routine, like number of the day, are that the students stop thinking about what they're doing. And there's no, the teachers who, the students who can do the number of the day yesterday, they can still do it today, they can still do it tomorrow. They're not actually progressing in their learning, and vice versa. The students that can't do it, they still can't do it, today, they still can't do it tomorrow because we're not actually giving them the right level of support.
I'm totally with you. I mean, I think the reason thinking features in the stuff I do is because I think that first bit is the most important bit. In fact, I think that's predominantly the job of the teacher is 80% of your time in there. And all, it's almost why I champion having fewer subjects to teach, because then you have more
Yeah.
time for that sort of that thought. And then that feeds into your initial stage, because you're thinking, well, why am I doing what I'm doing? Because where a starter gets criticized is when, like you said, it just becomes a part of the routine, and there's no thought on either end, because you've outlined, okay, here are our principles. This is what I want the purpose of this to be. And then you're going to use that information to feed either your lesson or subsequent lessons. So, it's chiming with my sort of preferences. And what I've done in the past is I've said to teachers, as long as that stuff is happening, I don't mind when it happens. Because I think there was a learning scientist's sort of summary of the research into retrieval practice, and they said the time of day didn't matter. So I had some
Yeah.
teachers who 8:30 in the morning would start off their maths lesson, and then they'd come back to it at like 11 o'clock. So they were almost splitting the time they had and stuff. And obviously, being a complete master, prerequisite knowledge, it essentially determines what you do. And when you're talking about teachers in Australia, I'm seeing a lot of parallels. Without sort of CPD from that's really well planned, you almost miss out on the richness. I mean, even just in this first little bit, you've got so much richness of thought, and I'm 100% on board. I'm like, yeah, if my teachers were doing this, I'd be all over that.
Yes. Yeah, and I guess that's the point of it as well, is that it's just trying to give some guidelines as to what sort of things teachers should be thinking about. 100%, like if you're able to make an informed decision as to, all right, we're not going to do retrieval practice at the start of the lesson, we're going to do it at this time of the day. That's fine, but it just, for me, like when teachers are trying to find structure and like to include everything, I like having it at the start of a lesson because that way you don't miss out on it. And like you said, it is so important that we do go over this stuff because a lot of the times, if you don't make time for it, it just doesn't happen, or it'll be an afterthought and it won't happen properly.
Absolutely. And that wasn't to say, I think, that wasn't a critique of the model. It was more, because there was quite a long conversation among secondary teachers in the UK about the
Yeah.
purpose of the daily starter. But I think you've nailed that. The sort of the new concept development, I think that's probably where different pedagogies, different ideologies will sort of diverge. What's your thought process here? What do obviously we've talked about the science of learning and things. So
Yeah.
obviously you've got modeling and this balance between sort of different elements of mathematics. What are you thinking here?
The way I'm looking at teaching a new concept is that a teacher is leading it. So they're modeling it, for the first time. So if students haven't been exposed to whatever the concept is, I'm kind of proposing that teachers actually teach it, and that will be through teaching the vocabulary, giving examples and non-examples, going through a live worked example, and building that conceptual and procedural understanding at the same time, depending on where they are within kind of their understanding of that concept will depend on like what sort of representation you use. So whether that is, pictorial, abstract, or concrete, that's going to be up to the teacher to be kind of adaptive, dependent on what information they're getting from their students. One of the things like I found with the modeling part, especially, is that, like I'm someone, I like a really pretty PowerPoint presentation or Google Slides. I think cognitive load theory, once you kind of get an understanding of it, you can get really quite particular with how you set out your slides. But one thing I've really noticed is that it's still vital that the teacher actually models it live in front of their students. We can make all of these fancy animations on our PowerPoint slides, but that is still too abstract for our students to actually be able to know like what they need to do when they're trying to work out their problem. Even if you're doing like a worked example with them, if you're not doing it the same way that they have to be, so say they've got their mini whiteboards out and you're doing it through your PowerPoint slides, I still get a lot of mistakes happening from my students when they're not able to kind of directly copy what I'm doing. And so, yeah, I think doing it in front of the students, like if you actually use, a mini whiteboard exactly the way that they are, you can actually help them set out their answer as well. I guess digging into like those worked examples, so that's one thing I've kind of really focused on is doing it live in front of them. Multiple examples as well. I've found, I know that you've spoken a lot about this as well. Like it's just really important that they, and again, this comes back to that planning part of it, of knowing what examples you're actually going to use and why you're going to actually use this example over that example, because there should be a purpose behind it. It's not just simply to give them another opportunity to see you do something, but actually to see, okay, we still follow this process even when the numbers change like this or whatever it is. So having multiple examples, examples and non-examples, doing it live, and even when you're doing like your example problem pairs. So when they're doing like a similar problem to the one that you've just modeled for them, the way I kind of like to structure it is you stop at each step. So after I'll do a complete model example, and then when I get them to do one with me, I'll stop at each step. So they're on their mini whiteboards in front of me. And so I'll do a step with them. We'll stop there. I'll do a check for understanding to see what they're understanding before moving on to the next step. Again, I find sometimes what we do as teachers is that we'll either completely skip the we do phase. So you go from doing a modeled example straight onto independent practice, but think that we're doing it with them. And so that might be like, just because they're sitting on the floor in front of us with their mini whiteboards, that we're calling that the we do, but we're actually leaving them on their own to do it themselves. That's a kind of a misconception that I see from teachers in that sort of phase. The other thing as well is, stopping at each step rather than waiting until the end to check for understanding, because if you're trying to look at 30 whiteboards all at once and you've got multiple steps on that whiteboard, it's next to impossible to be able to actually work out where they went wrong, even if they've followed the steps that you've set out. They've obviously gone wrong somewhere along the way, but it can be really hard to see, especially, if you haven't taught them how to set out their work properly on their whiteboard. It can get quite messy. I'm sure we've all experienced it. So I find like if you're doing that we do phase, stop at each step and actually check for understanding then and there. And that might even just be like looking at each row one at a time before moving on. And I found that really useful. While it can be slower. Initially, like you're probably holding back, some of your students a little bit because they might be more than capable of doing the whole thing. But for me as a teacher, like I prefer to make sure that all of my students are actually understanding the steps before I'll release those that are capable, because I know that I'm going to miss students otherwise. And so I'd rather slow it down at the start and then release them at different stages than miss them.
The word pace has a lot to answer for, because for a long time it was, that you need better pace in your lessons. And it almost became a synonym for speed, when actually that's not what pace means. It's about it's relative to the class, relative to pupils. And I think that's definitely something that we need to consider in terms of curricula and classroom practice. But it's just so apparent how much of this sort of part depends on that planning and preparation phase, because there's so much domain-specific knowledge necessary for the teachers. If you're trying to do that on the run or on the fly, it's not. I mean, I've been that teacher, and it's not going to work. You need to have mapped out. This is a story I want to tell with my questions, and here's how best I can do it. Because, like you say, I think I've only ever really used PowerPoint as a vehicle or a vessel for my questions. So here's my example problem pairs, and it's very easy to have them both side by side, and then sort of but I'm going to use this whiteboard for my work, that kind of thing. But if you're not going into this prepared, I think I'm struggling to think. what's your approach then to supporting teachers in developing their subject and pedagogical content knowledge to get to the point where they can execute this sort of effectively?
Yeah, good question, because I think I'm probably at the stage now where I am starting to deliver this sort of professional learning to teachers. And I've tried a couple of different ways of doing it. I've tried giving them like a full overview of like, basically what I'm going through now of what a evidence informed, maths lesson can look like. I've also tried breaking it down like into like the different phases. So just delivering PL on, that first part, the retrieval practice phase of it. And also like really getting specific on like worked examples and, going into all of those nuances that we've been speaking about. I think professional learning and in terms of like trying to change teacher practice, it's one thing to deliver good information, but a lot of the stuff actually happens in the follow up part of it. So like that means me making sure that teachers properly understand what it is that I have spoken to them about and presented. A lot of the times, we over assimilate information, so we think that we're already doing it. So say I've given information on worked examples. Teachers will think that they're already doing worked examples without actually taking in the differences that I've spoken about. So whether that's to do with like example problem pairs, or stopping at each step, or checking for understanding and how you're going to do that. So I think, yeah, that's the important part, is actually following through with the PL the professional learning that you've delivered, and making sure that firstly teachers properly understand it, so they've got the knowledge that they need to take into the classroom. Secondly, that they're feeling supported to actually, if it's work examples that we're looking at, they're feeling supported to actually know how to put together a worked example for their next lesson. Again, like that's something that sometimes we will skip. So we'll deliver the information, but then we don't actually give them time to put together worked examples with support. Because again, like some teachers, they may not have fully understood what we're saying, but they were too afraid to put their hand up and ask for help in a whole school professional learning session. And so they've left it kind of, leaving knowing, all right, I need to do something, but I still don't really know what I need to be doing. And then the other thing as well is just kind of keeping people accountable. Like there are so many different ways that teachers are being pulled in terms of their time. If they feel like they're not being held accountable to change their practice, a lot of the times they're just not going to do it, because it takes effort, to change your actual teacher habits, which is what we're asking them to do. It requires a lot of effort. I always use, I've got like a sporting background, and I used to be a personal trainer. So I always use the analogy of like start of the year, New Year's resolutions. Everyone's got a New Year's resolution, and how many people actually follow through with it? They don't follow through with it because, they'll set goals like, all right, I want to exercise every day. Well, firstly, that's next to impossible. And secondly, as soon as they fail one day, they're like, all right, I'm failed, I'm done, I can't do it, it's too hard. And so they give up. And so it's the same thing with teachers. If we're not giving them the proper support to firstly set realistic goals, but then secondly, actually support them in implementing it and helping them understand, all right, you might not get it perfect straight away, but that's just how, changing habits works, is that you're naturally like, you're going into a live audience, as a performer, which is what we are, teachers are performers. You're going to this kind of live audience, who are really unforgiving. They're baying for your blood, basically. They're waiting for you to stuff up. And then, school leaders are telling the teachers, all right, you need to be trying something for the first time in front of this live audience. And it's completely different to how you've done things before, So I completely understand why, professional learning doesn't always translate into changes in teaching practice, because it's hard, and it's something that I'm always thinking about, like, how can we support teachers in actually getting this bit of information moving in their classroom?
Like you say, we're so busy, and whatever gets prioritized, that's what gets sort of action, so to speak. But it's really interesting you talk about the sort of the language of habit formation and things like that there, because I've seen that as a really positive shift in the discourse around teacher development and habits and routines and things like that there, because they're so much more actionable than broad general statements about what you should do with your practice. Because I find like the teaching standards, whenever I first became a teacher, I really didn't understand what they meant. But if someone gives me a habit or routine to build in my classroom, it's night and day almost, isn't it?
Oh yeah, definitely, and I think it also just like shows that it is behavior change that we're asking for. Like, it's not, because the old way of delivering professional learning or professional development is that it's knowledge changing, but we want more than that, because it's one thing to change how teachers think, but if it doesn't make any difference to what they're actually doing, we're not going to see any changes in actual student learning outcomes. And I think that's the important part. That's what we're trying to achieve, is improvements in how our students actually learn.
I mean, we're going to discuss problem solving when we record sort of the opposite version of this interview. So I reckon we'll probably leave
Yes,
that as a teaser for anyone that, if they want to see how this conversation continues,
I think
um,
so. Yes.
check that out. But I mean, we talked at the start about how your thought processes are evolving, and that makes sense as teachers. And what are you thinking about next? And what are you, where are you going with your thinking?
After we've kind of done that initial modeling phase, and we're following like that explicit instruction process of, I do, we do, you do, but really focusing on like that guided part. Like I mentioned before, a lot of teachers, they skip that or they don't do it properly. So being really prepared for it, and then also being prepared to actually reteach it as well. I think, like, we've spoken about the pressures that teachers feel when it comes to time, but for me, if the students haven't learned it, we haven't taught it. So we've got to make sure that, we're really looking at different ways that either we can teach it, or how can we provide more scaffolding for those students that aren't fully understanding it. So I really like the backwards fading technique. And again, it kind of comes back to giving less work for our students to think about, like really just honing in on one particular element that they need to be thinking about, so that that way they're able to get that part right. Because when it comes to maths, like most students are able to learn it. It's just that we take too big a step a lot of the time. And you'll just see their drop in motivation when that happens. Like they'll go from feeling confident, and then all of a sudden we've taken this big leap, and like the information that we're getting as teachers is we're thinking, all right, they've got it, and now they can go off into independent practice. And then all of a sudden we're wondering, oh, why are they still struggling? Because they were giving us information that they understood it a moment ago, but that's purely because we've taken too big a step. And what I see a lot of the times is that teachers will give a worksheet or a bunch of questions which are too different to what they've just been modeling. And while the teacher, so they're suffering from the curse of knowledge, the teacher will be able to see how that concept is related. The students can't quite see it. So, providing those scaffolds. And then it also then comes back to that practice part. One of the other kind of techniques that I've played around with is like the reverse release. So a lot of the times, like, we tend to release like those students that are capable, but sometimes it might actually be the opposite way. So you release those students that need more deliberate practice on a part, and then the other students, they might be ready to kind of move on to that next step. So you actually keep those students with you and teach them that next step. So I found that kind of useful as well. And teachers, always asking about like, how can I differentiate? What sort of things can I do? So I've found that a useful thing to talk to them about as well. And then the other thing as well is, when we're looking at like reasoning, the self-explanation prompts, and I know like Michael Pershin, he talks a lot about this stuff when it comes to actually getting students to think about, the steps that either they've gone right or they've gone wrong in, or what they need to be thinking about at each step, or they might be looking at worked examples that are right or wrong, and then trying to give a reason as to where that answer was right or wrong. And I find that really useful as well. And again, when we're looking at that differentiating the lesson, that could be quite useful.
Again, I think it's really clear. There's a rationale behind every decision you've made, and I think that's central. I mean, I really like Michael's work on prompts. It's something that perhaps I need to get better at. And one of my colleagues, Dave Taylor, is big into sort of the science behind prompts and how they, how
Yes.
work examples might work. He's very much in favor of backward feeded examples, and he's got a blog/website with examples for secondary teachers. And there's so many different directions you can go, but it's about the idea of, well, what do I want to achieve through this, and then
Yes.
that guides your decision making. So I mean, you're providing teachers with here's your playbook. It's not going to be the same all the time, is it? But go on ahead. Here are the things that might be impactful in your classroom.
Yeah, that's the hope for it, is that that's the way that teachers can use it. Is these are a bunch of kind of tools in a way that you can be using and pull out different ones as you need them. But I think like a lot of teachers, they haven't got this sort of structure to their current maths lessons. And for me, it just helps a lot, especially for those that don't have that pedagogical content knowledge that we're kind of talking about. Just knowing what sorts of things they should be including in a lesson, or could be including in a lesson, and how it's going to support the students.
Because I mean, you're condensing a ton of research and a ton of the literature, so it's going to take people time to, so hopefully what they do is they will be listening to your podcast, they'll be reading your blog, and the blogs of other voices with similar messages, sort of around the globe, really, and then taking that and sort of as I'm going to take control of my own destiny if it's not on the national agenda, because you can't really control the national agenda, can you?
No, we can try, but we definitely don't have that sort of control. And I think like I'm working with a bunch of schools at the moment, and we're going to start to put together some different videos as well, as so to kind of show like what this can look like at different stages of learning, different year groups. I think like it'll be really good to have some examples of, okay, so this is what it can look like for a year 1, year 2 class, and this is what it can look like for a year 5, year 6 class, because there are going to be differences in how teachers use concrete examples and how teachers use abstract examples. I think that'll be kind of the next steps, and we've got like an organisation here, OCA, which is similar to Oak over in the UK, and so they're also helping with this process, where they've got like a bunch of lessons online which they're developing, which kind of follow quite a similar process to what I've put together as well. And they've got a bunch of daily review slides, which I've found really useful, because it saves me from having to develop that part of it as well. I'll be interested to kind of hear your thoughts on complete maths, and whether that would be user friendly for Australian teachers. But I know that what I've seen of it in terms of from a teacher perspective, it looks really promising as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's designed with the idea of supporting teachers in becoming better and improving their practice bit by bit, by almost encouraging them to behave in certain ways, and to because obviously the curriculum is free, the sequence is free, but then you've got the sort of the paid for side of the product, and it'll be things like generating retrieval quizzes based on the input on your timetable, so you can then set a quiz that goes across the last week, the last 2 weeks, the last all the way up to 2 months, basically. Or you can you know? So for me, one of the reasons why I was very keen to join the team at Complete Maths is because it's very much in line with how I see the teaching of learning, you know? So even on the free level, you've got things like the prerequisite knowledge, the misconceptions, you know, I've tried to push people towards, not push, but guide people towards research. And I've gone for a broad church of research. I haven't just chosen my favorite ideologically you know, sort of preferences. But like in stage zero, there'll be research about early reading or early number and early development, stuff like that there. So for me, that was one of the, you know, the main reasons I really enjoy my job and was keen to sort of join the team is because it's very much based on the science of learning, you know. So I think teachers in Australia would find it useful. You know, I mean, anyone can sign up, so you know
Yeah.
why not? This could easily have been a 2 hour interview, and you know there are probably more questions I'd like to ask you about this. But in the
Yeah.
in the interest of getting to work on time this morning, I suppose we just got time for one tiny question. What are you reading about to develop your thinking going forward? You know, so what's the area that you're thinking, oh, I really want to develop my understanding of that, so I'm going to read about that.
Yeah. Look, I know that you ask all your guests this question, and I'm really terrible because I probably read about like 8+ books at any one time. and I don't know if it's because like I like dipping in and out and pulling, you know, bits out that I need right then and there. But you know, or it might be because of my role where I am kind of being needed to be across, you know, different areas. You know, so obviously a lot of mathematics things I've been reading about. I mentioned the book before, you know, How Children Learn the Science of Maths. I've also been reading, I'll give you a non-educational book that I've found really interesting is Range from David Epstein. I found that really interesting in just looking at like how people become like the best in their field. And so, yeah, it looks at that kind of, you know, Tiger Woods type of person versus a Roger Federer type of person, and, you know, what they turn out to be like. So I found that really interesting. You know, I'm also reading a lot of books to do with like professional learning, facilitating teacher teams and authentic PLCs is another book I've been reading. Daniel R. Venables. Yeah, so I also do a bit of work around that stuff, and just trying to, I guess, improve how teachers communicate at school and making sure we make the most of that time as well. And in terms of being more effective, a lot of the conversations we have at schools are surface level. You know, how are you going? And, you know, how is today's lesson? There's a lot of whinging, but we don't really get to a lot of that kind of deep level conversation, or, you know, or dialogue where teachers are talking about, you know, things that are actually troubling and then working out solutions for those problems. Yeah, so just trying to work out ways that we can get to that part of our conversations better. You know, so whether that is using meeting times more effectively, or you know, making sure that there's times within professional learning to actually look at how we're going to make what we've just learned more actionable.
Nice, I love that, and I love the fact that, you know, I'm 100% on board with multiple books at the same time.
Yeah.
But also the reading art of field. There's so much we can learn from other fields, like that's applicable to education, you know. And some of the stuff that the source material for thinking deeply, just randomly came by reading them. Oh, that actually, you know, and making those connections. So 100% with it.
For all of you Kofi, Kofi, Kofufu, however you pronounce it, you damn lovely supporters. It's a song going out to you, to you. Okay, here we go. Nikki Anna P. Septi, Stephanie Taylor, Mrs. B.S. Ataya, Adam, Katie, Liv Dempsey, Becca, Jenford, Susie, Brown, and Cio, Netchio, Rachel, I am Al, Jessica, Tom Oakley, Tom Brassington, Jessica, Tom Oakley, Tom Brassington, LJ, and last but not least, my lovely little Amy Bill. So they help us pay the bills. So a massive thank you out to Dappy family. Coffee supporters help us keeping it ad-free. There's far more content coming just round the bend. Thank you all for helping our very special friends. Friends. Very special friends.
So it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and like I say, hopefully not for the last time, but also to say thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.